The chapel is silent, but the silence is not pure. It carries with it a weight, the kind that presses against your chest and makes every breath feel borrowed. The candles that line the stone walls struggle to burn steady, their flames bending and trembling as if the very air resists them. The smell reaches you before the sight does. Thick, sour, metallic. It is not the scent of holy incense but something darker, heavier, a corruption that no ritual can disguise. Before you stands the coffin of a king. The wood groans under the weight it holds, expanding, straining, as though the body inside refuses to rest. A sudden crack echoes like a thunderclap in the stillness. Splinters burst outward, and from the broken seams, blackened fluid seeps. It runs slowly, thick as tar, spreading across the floor in jagged rivers that glisten faintly in the candlelight. The stench grows stronger, curling into your throat, clawing at your stomach, until it is almost unbearable. And then you hear it, the low shuffle of paws on stone. Out of the shadows slip the dogs, thin, ragged, their eyes reflecting the flickering flames. They do not hesitate. They lower their muzzles to the oozing liquid and lap it greedily, tongues dragging through the foul seepage. Their growls and snorts echo in the chapel like a desecration, louder than any prayer that has ever been spoken within these walls. Here lies Henry VIII, once the most powerful man in England, reduced in death to a feast for strays. The king who ruled with terror, who broke with Rome, who sent queens to the scaffold, lies undone, not by sword, nor by rebellion, but by the betrayal of his own body and the hunger of scavenging beasts. How could this be the end of a monarch who bent nations to his will? How does a man crowned in glory collapse into decay so grotesque that even in death, he could not escape humiliation? This is not ceremony. This is not legend. This is the disgusting death of Henry VIII. A king consumed by rot, mocked by fate, and, at the last, eaten by dogs. He was not always the bloated tyrant whose corpse split open in disgrace. Once he was the very image of power made flesh. Picture him in his youth, Henry Tudor, second son of a cautious king, crowned unexpectedly at just 17. The court gasped when he entered a room, not only because of his title, but because of what they saw. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with hair that shone like red gold in the sunlight. His skin was fair, his bearing majestic, his every movement radiating the vigor of a born athlete. To those who had known only the weary face of his father, Henry was a revelation. He danced with the grace of a noble, fought with the strength of a knight, and charmed with the words of a poet. He rode in tournaments, wielding lance and sword with a ferocity that made the crowds roar his name. A Venetian ambassador, dazzled by the sight, wrote that no prince in Christendom could match his beauty, his presence, or his promise. For the people of England, this was their golden monarch, a living symbol of Renaissance ideals. Learned, athletic, radiant with health. He was the king who would make them proud, who would lead their realm into glory. His laughter carried through the halls, his music filled the chambers, and his confidence spread like fire through a court eager to be lifted out of its shadows. But beauty is a fragile crown, and vigor a fleeting gift. Beneath the brilliance of Henry's youth was already written the first lines of tragedy. For every man who climbs so high, the descent is waiting. The higher the prince is raised, the harder the fall that must follow. Imagine witnessing that golden prince's final decay. If this story already shocks you, yet you're still not subscribed to Cursed Chronicles, ask yourself, why not? Don't just watch in silence while others shape history's memory. January 1536. The tilt yard at Greenwich was alive with noise, the thunder of hooves, the clash of steel, the cheers of a crowd hungry for spectacle. At its center, Henry rode not as a king encased in ceremony, but as a warrior, eager to prove his body still matched his crown. The lance was lowered, the charge begun, and in a moment of calamity, his horse collapsed beneath him. The great mass of beast and armor drove him into the earth with crushing force. He did not rise. For 2 hours the king lay unconscious, the court frozen in terror. Whispers spread like wildfire. England's monarch was dead, the line broken, the future uncertain. But Henry stirred, gasped, clung to breath. He survived. Yet the price of that survival was etched deep into his flesh. His right leg, shattered and torn, never healed. It became an open ulcer, raw and seeping, its stench announcing him before his presence filled a room. Physicians tried every tool of their trade, hot irons that burned, powders laced with mercury, the cruel bleedings meant to balance humors. Nothing closed the wound. It festered year after year, until the proud king was followed everywhere by the odor of corruption. The injury did not merely rot his flesh. It began to corrode his mind. Pain gnawed at him without cease, and with it came suspicion, paranoia, and uncontrollable rage. Those who had once basked in the warmth of his charm now trembled before the storm of his moods. Executions multiplied. Friends, advisors, even wives felt the blade at his command. Some historians would later suggest the fall had shaken more than his body, that it had rattled the very seat of his reason. Perhaps the blow fractured not only bone but mind, leaving behind a man haunted by shadows that no crown could banish. The contrast was stark. The youth who once embodied vigor and light was transforming into something darker, bloated by injury, shackled by pain, and poisoned by suspicion. The warrior who had ridden with grace was now a monarch carried by machines, glaring with eyes that trusted no one, not even those who loved him. Every fall has its trigger. For Henry, it was this accident. For Cursed Chronicles, it's when viewers learn but don't subscribe. Will you help the story rise? The wound never closed, and the man who once defined vitality began to unravel. His body, once lean and athletic, swelled until it was almost unrecognizable. The young prince, with a waist slender enough to glide through armor, now ballooned to grotesque proportions. From 89 centimeters, his waistline expanded beyond 130. His frame, once admired, sagged under the weight of more than 180 kilograms. He became a prisoner inside his own flesh. The palaces of England had to bend to his decline. Door frames were widened to let his bulk pass. A pulley system was devised to move him from chamber to chamber, his body so heavy it defied the strength of servants alone. The once proud rider of horses, who had thundered across tournament fields with lance in hand, was reduced to an immobile figure, hoisted like cargo through his own halls. His appetite became legend, a reflection of his crumbling restraint. Kitchen accounts reveal a daily intake of more than 5,000 calories. Meat pies stuffed with venison, beef, pork, and lamb. Goblets of wine and flagons of ale that washed it all down. Vegetables were rare, an afterthought in a diet built on gluttony. What should have been nourishment became fuel for his decay, each feast driving him deeper into sickness. Physicians swarmed around him, their remedies as desperate as they were destructive. They cauterized his ulcers with hot irons, scarring the flesh but never cleansing the rot. They lathered his wounds with salves laced with mercury and arsenic, poisons that sickened him further under the guise of healing. They bled him regularly, believing balance could be restored by draining his veins, leaving him weaker each time. And all the while the ulcers widened, deepened, until even bone showed through, a vision of decomposition in the body of a living king. The stench was unbearable. Accounts tell of courtiers who could smell his approach before they saw him, a reek so strong it seeped through walls and lingered in chambers long after he had left. Those forced to serve in his presence soaked handkerchiefs in perfume and held them to their faces, masking their disgust behind fabric and ceremony. To reveal revulsion was to risk death, so they endured, choking on the scent of their sovereign. This was not the prince who once dazzled Europe. This was a grotesque figure, trapped in flesh that betrayed him, propped up by ritual and fear. The spectacle of power remained, but beneath the silks and the crown was a man decaying in plain sight. Even as his body failed, Henry clung to the illusion of youth, seeking it not in his reflection, now bloated and grotesque, but in the company of women half his age. In 1540 he married Catherine Howard, a girl of only 19. To the court, it was a spectacle. The once radiant king, now swollen and fetid, parading beside a bride who could have been his daughter. He called it a renewal, a return to vigor. But behind the painted masks and choreographed dances, the truth was plain. Catherine recoiled from him. What was whispered in corners soon became open knowledge. The young queen, unable to bear her husband's stinking wounds and immense frame, sought warmth elsewhere, in the arms of a courtier not yet ruined by disease and age. For a moment, she tasted the freedom Henry's shadow denied her. But freedom under such a king was always fleeting. When the affair was uncovered, Henry's vengeance was merciless. Catherine was dragged to the block, her youthful beauty silenced by the fall of an executioner's blade. She had entered his life as a symbol of renewal and left as yet another ghost condemned by his rage. His final marriage told a different story, though no less bleak. In 1543 he took Catherine Parr as his sixth wife. She was not chosen for her beauty or youth, but for her steadiness. She became more nurse than spouse, tending to his rotting flesh, enduring his foul moods, and holding together the fragments of his household as the king decayed before her eyes. She dabbed at his ulcers, oversaw his medicines, and comforted a man who had once been the terror of Europe, now reduced to a cripple gasping against the weight of his own body. This contrast could not have been more stark. To the outside world, Henry VIII still embodied majesty, crowned, robed, feared. But behind the curtains of his chambers, the truth was unmasked. A tyrant rotting alive, propped up by ceremony and silence, attended not by a queen in splendor but by a caretaker in resignation. The king who had commanded loyalty through awe now inspired only obedience through fear and pity. These twisted unions remind us, power cannot buy love. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, subscribe. And if you don't, at least tell us in the comments why you'd rather stay silent. The final years of Henry's life were not merely decline, they were torment. His body became a battlefield of disease. Physicians of our time would name it plainly. Diabetes that thickened his blood, gout that set his joints aflame, hypertension that strained his failing heart. Some whispered of syphilis, though the truth remains debated. What is certain is this: his body was collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. Gangrene spread from his ulcerated legs, the flesh blackening and rotting while he still lived. The smell was beyond endurance, saturating the very air of the court. Courtiers soaked rags in perfumes, clutching them to their faces as they bowed, forcing smiles while the odor of decay clawed at their lungs. The man who once commanded respect through presence now drove men to the edge of nausea simply by entering a room. His nights were the worst. Fevers burned through him, shaking him with chills that no blanket could soothe. Delirium seized him in waves, visions of the past, faces long dead rising to confront him. In those moments he muttered the names of women who had once defined his reign. Jane Seymour, who had given him the son he desired and died in the attempt. And Boleyn, who met the blade under his command, her ghost said to haunt his sleep. These names escaped his lips like confessions, fragments of a conscience too late to save him. But within the walls of his palace, truth could not be spoken. To suggest that the king was dying was treason. Physicians, courtiers, even servants bowed to the fiction that his health could yet be restored. They lied in whispers, denied the evidence of their own senses, while the body before them sagged under the weight of death. The silence was suffocating, an empire of fear built not on majesty but on denial. He was surrounded by silence, just as many watch these videos in silence. Don't let history repeat itself here. Subscribe to Cursed Chronicles. In the winter of 1547, the silence around Henry could no longer conceal the truth. His body, swollen with disease and rot, had reached its end. On the night of January 27th, as he lay in his chamber at Whitehall, the Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was summoned to his side. The king could no longer speak. His lips were cracked, his breath shallow, each exhale rattling like the final notes of a drum fading into silence. When asked if he died in the faith, Henry gave no words, only the faint pressure of his hand around Cranmer's. That small gesture, his last, was the final flicker of a once commanding presence. By dawn, January 28th, Henry VIII, once the most powerful man in England, was dead at 55. But death brought no peace. His bulk presented a grotesque challenge for the embalmers, whose primitive methods could not hope to preserve what disease had already devoured. The body was cut open, the viscera removed, the cavity packed with spices and herbs. Yet it was a losing battle. The sheer mass of his corpse began to betray the secrecy of the embalming table almost at once. Gases built within the coffin, sealed too poorly for a body so vast. Days passed. His funeral procession paused at Syon Abbey, and it was there that degradation revealed itself in its most horrifying form. The coffin cracked. The weight of the king's remains forced foul liquid through the wood. It seeped to the floor, dark, oozing, spreading across sacred stones. And when night fell, dogs crept from the shadows. They lowered their muzzles to the fluid and licked. Chroniclers, horrified, recorded the scene. The body of Henry VIII, once a monarch who defied popes and commanded nations, reduced to a feast for strays. The humiliation did not end there. His funeral, delayed for weeks, was haunted by the stench. As the coffin was borne into St. George's Chapel at Windsor, the odor of rot pressed against every noble nose, overpowering even the richest incense. Beneath the chants and the solemn prayers, whispers carried. The king who demanded awe in life was mocked in death, his final dignity stolen by his own corruption. Thus the great Henry VIII was laid to rest, not as the titan of portraits and royal proclamations, but as a decaying carcass, his last legacy a scene of horror and shame. He was lowered into the earth at Windsor, buried beside Jane Seymour, the one wife who had given him what he prized above all else, a son. To Henry, Jane's memory was sanctified by that single gift, and so she alone earned the honor of lying beside him in death. But even here, in the grave, irony clung to him like a curse. For the son he had broken kingdoms to obtain would not outlive his youth. Edward VI, the pale boy for whom so many had died, took the throne at 9 years old. His reign lasted only 6 fleeting years. At 15, the child king was gone, consumed by illness before he could secure the dynasty his father had sacrificed everything to protect. The line Henry fought so brutally to preserve, the male succession for which he spilled blood and toppled queens, crumbled almost at once. It was not through his son that his shadow endured, but through the daughters he had doubted, dismissed, even tried to erase. Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, rose first, pulling England briefly back toward the Catholic faith Henry had abandoned. Her reign was marked by fire, by the burnings of Protestants, earning her the name Bloody Mary. After her came Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman Henry condemned to the scaffold under charges of treason and adultery. The very child whose legitimacy he once questioned became the sovereign who forged England's golden age. The irony is merciless. A king obsessed with producing a son to carry his name into eternity instead found his immortality written by women. Women he scorned, women he betrayed, women who lived in the shadow of his cruelty. Through them, the Tudor legacy endured, not as he imagined, but in defiance of his intentions. His desperate grasp for control gave way to the one truth he could never command. History chooses its heirs, not kings. These twisted turns of fate exposed the hollowness of his triumphs. The monarch who shattered marriages, defied Rome, and drenched England in blood to secure a male heir lies rotting beside the wife who bore him one, while the crown passed into the hands of daughters he never believed could rule. History remembers his power, yes, but it remembers more the irony. The women he used and discarded became his truest legacy. He began as a vision of majesty, radiant, athletic, adored, a prince who seemed to embody the very perfection of kingship. Yet he ended as a putrid corpse, leaking fluids onto the floor of a chapel, his dignity devoured by dogs. The arc of Henry VIII is not merely a tale of power, but of its inevitable decay. From the shining youth who dazzled ambassadors to the grotesque tyrant whose stench preceded him, his life is a mirror of how quickly glory can rot. For all his commands, for all the blood spilled in his name, Henry could not command his own body. No crown, no decree, no execution could silence the ulcers that festered in his legs or the gangrene that blackened his flesh. He broke with Rome, defied popes, and reshaped nations, yet he could not rewrite the laws of nature. His death was proof that absolute power, however fierce, remains helpless before the slow cruelty of time. In the end, he was no different from the humblest of his subjects. The same fate that claimed beggars claimed the king who once held England in his fist. The portraits show him broad, commanding, his eyes unflinching. But behind the painted mask was a man trapped in decay, terrified of betrayal, muttering the names of the dead as delirium consumed him. His true face was not the image hanging in palaces, but the one hidden in the stench of his chambers. This is the lesson of Henry VIII. Power is a fragile disguise, and behind it all men are equal. Kings may bend nations, but they cannot bend death. His body, once admired as the pinnacle of royalty, became the very symbol of transience, the reminder that glory is fleeting, and flesh will always betray its master. And so the man who altered the course of English history ended not in splendor, but in humiliation. A leaking coffin, a grotesque spectacle, a body stripped of all majesty. It is this dissonance, the distance between what he wanted remembered and what could not be hidden, that makes his death unforgettable. Do not look away from it. Do not let silence bury it as courtiers once tried to do. If you have walked with me through this descent, from radiant prince to rotting king, then carry this story forward. Subscribe to Cursed Chronicles and ensure these shadows of history are not forgotten.